I'm Eva Derman, president of the Society for the History of Czechoslovak Jews. I would like to extend my thanks to all who joined us today. It is your participation and donations that enable the Society to be still active more than 60 years after its founding. I welcome here two guests, especially, that I didn't expect. Here is Professor Jindřich Toman, who just surprised us from Michigan, and the director of the Jewish Museum in Prague, Pavla Niklova, a very active board member of the Society. Today's talk is the second talk in the series of lectures on the topic of Jewish music. This series of lectures, in part supported by a grant from the Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We acknowledge also support of the Bohemian Benevolent and Literary Association and the support of the Czech Consulate in New York. By Jewish music, we do not mean music that originated with Jews. We mean by music that is in these days and was also in the past centuries associated with Jewish communities. Secular music at weddings and other festivals, liturgical music in prayer houses, folk songs such as those that mothers sang as lullabies, or music inspired by Jewish mysticism. This series of talks is about Ashkenazic Jewish music, particularly music in Central and Eastern Europe. Our first talk by Walter Zev Feldman was about klezmer music and dance. Today we'll hear from Cantor Matt Austerklein about liturgical music, and in the coming fall, in October, Professor Gordon Dale will talk about Hasidic music. Jewish music found its way to classical music by both Jewish and non-Jewish composers. The topic of the concluding talk in this series in December, it will be given by Professor Michael Beckerman. The lecture on klezmer music and dance was given a couple of months ago, and it can be viewed on the Society's YouTube channel, Society for the History of Czechoslovak Jews YouTube. Many of our past events, including the recent blood libel lecture series, can be also viewed there. Today's talk will be posted on the YouTube channel too. Walter Feldman's talk brought us to the Czech Lands, and today's talk will bring us to the Czech Lands of the 16th to 18th century too. As Walter Feldman noted, it was in Bohemia and Moravia where in the 16th, 17th century, during the reign of Emperor Rudolf II, the first musicians called klezmerim came existence as a guild. About a century later, I may not be right, as today's speaker will tell us, Bohemia and Moravia were also the site of transformation of Ashkenazic cantors into music professionals. What was their music like? What was the influence on the cantor professions on Ashkenazic prayer houses? And we will get some answers to these questions from Cantor Matt Austerklein today. Cantor Matt Austerklein received his cantorial ordination from the Jewish Theological Seminary in 2011 and serves as the cantor of Temple Beth Sholom in Sarasota, Florida now. He's also a PhD candidate in Jewish studies at Halle-Wittenberg University, where he's writing his dissertation on Ashkenazic cantors in early modern Europe. For those who did not know, I just learned that University of Wittenberg is the alma mater of Shakespeare's Hamlet. Cantor Austerklein is the editor of a number of books and writer of a number of articles on Jewish music, and serves on the faculty of the European Academy of Jewish Liturgy and L'École Rabbinique de Paris. He was recently awarded the Samuel Rosenbaum Award for Scholarship and Creativity, the Cantors Assembly's highest honor. After his presentation, I'm sure he will be happy to answer any questions that would arise from the audience.
Thank you very much, Eva. Thank you so much to everyone who's come out on a Thursday night here to Bohemian National Hall. And thank you so much to the Society for the History of Czechoslovak Jews for hosting me for this lecture. In typical talks about Jewish music, I never thought I would be thinking about Prague and Czech Lands. It's not something I knew from the concert stage or the synagogue growing up. But as my research has cooked over the last number of years, I've discovered that this place is actually a critical part, I would say even the cradle of the Ashkenazic cantorate, where many of the very recognizable features that we would know from the cantorial world today first flowered. Singing a lot, having instruments for Friday night services, the original Friday Night Live, including the organ, the use of musical notation by Ashkenazic Jews, the roots of the Ashkenazi choir, and the development of the cantor as a consummate and even full-time music professional. So I'm going to take you on this fascinating journey of how this came to be over the course of this evening. So some cities are great for music. We're in one right now, New York. I've been to a number. Vienna is another one, Odessa, Cleveland, which is near where I live. And Prague was definitely one of these cities, especially for Jewish music. Although the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 48 was really bad for Christians, particularly Protestants in Prague, it was actually not so bad for Jews, who were protected largely by the Habsburg Empire and who swelled the Josefov, the Jewish quarter in Prague, to about 10,000 Jewish inhabitants by the year 1700. Now, lots of Jews meant lots of music. The Habsburg during this period supported Jews' independence and institutions, often against popular opinion. So the story of Jewish Prague is one of increasing political complexity for Jews and also increasing musical complexity as well. Those of you who are here for Professor Feldman's lecture will remember in this very hall a couple months or weeks ago he had described how Prague's klezmorim, their professional Jewish musicians, were known among Christians since the early 1500s, heard in the courts and weddings of Christian noblemen, and by the 1600s had incorporated into a formal guild, the klezmer guild. And Dr. Feldman talks about how this was an increase in status for the musicians themselves. They could do collective bargaining as a labor union against the Christian music labor union and get the rights to play at baptisms, weddings, feasts, and even Christian religious services. And when the Christian Musicians Guild complained, the authorities said, sorry, we're going to let the Jews play. So, just as the environment for klezmorim, for professional Jewish musicians, rose in prominence and stature and in impact in Prague and in Bohemia and Moravia, so too is the case with the cantors. Let me start with the title image of today's talk. Take a look at this. Anyone recognize this little piece of music? This is Salomone Rossi's Hashirim Asher Li Shlomo. This is Salomone Rossi, the great Jewish-Italian madrigalist he published his Hebrew madrigals in 1620. This is a part book from that. But here on the bottom, we have some very interesting things, and we have some solfege in Yiddish. Why? So this copy of Salomone Rossi's Hebrew madrigals is part of the Oppenheim collection in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. It belonged to Rabbi David Oppenheim, the famed book collector, who was also head of the yeshiva in Mikulov, or in Nikolsburg, from 1691, and he became chief rabbi later of Prague. But before this, and this copy of Rossi was in his possession in the 1730s. But before it came into the hands of Rabbi Oppenheim, either in Prague or in Moravia, it had at least two Ashkenazic owners. One of them, you can actually see his signature on the bottom. I believe he was a printer in Wilhelmsdorf in Germany. But the other one was named a cantor named Moshe ben Rav Avraham. He was the cantor and community leader, the Rosh HaKehillah of Nikolsburg in Moravia. And his father, Rabbi Abraham son of Rabbi Zekel, was a cantor in Krakow. One thing you'll see, by the way, throughout the night is that the cantorate in Prague and Bohemia and Moravia broadly was an often rabbinic pursued profession. There are many, many rabbis fulfilling these roles as cantors, which was actually traditional among Ashkenazi Jews. There's a Sephardic source from, I think, Corfu, and the rabbi is writing. He goes off to yeshiva in Germany. He says, I can't believe this is so interesting. They make all their rabbis into cantors. This is crazy. Of course, it's not crazy now. There are so many cantors going back to school to become rabbis. But I digress. I'm looking at least one right now. So let's learn more about this musical piece from the cantor's inscription. This is Israel Adler's transcription. It says, "B'asher chanani Elokim shelamati bazeh hamuzika l'shem yichud hakodesh baruch hu l'nageh b'shirit hishbachot." Since the Lord favored me, so that I studied in this book of music or musica, for the sake of the unity of the Holy One, blessed be He, to chant songs of praise in the synagogue and to exalt Him in a voice of exaltation. So here we have the marshalling of sheet music, of musica, as a way to honor God. Among Christians, this is a normal idea. Among Jews, this is, I'd say, a fairly new idea in Bohemia and Moravia. But what we see in this region is the beginnings of emergence of a positive Ashkenazic attitude towards musica. Now, what is musica, or chochmat ha-musica? These are the science of music, or music. These are ambiguous terms, and sometimes they simply relate to forms of non-Jewish music from Western Europe. But minimally, musica and chochmat ha-musica, as we see with Rossi and here, refer to notation. So the reference to music as a science, as a chochmah in Hebrew, is already present in Italy amongst the Ashkenazim in 1539 with Elia Bochur's work, and of course in the context of Rossi as well. So access and experimentation with Western sound is expanding in this era, not just in Prague, but also in Nikolsburg in Moravia, which had its own klezmer guild and negotiated privileges with the authorities, and its own instrumental Friday night services, and as we will see later, well-documented Ashkenazi choral assistance already by 1680. So Cantor Moshe, as we see, this is the bottom, but I'll show you the transcription. Cantor Moshe, we see, now takes the time to write out a melody he heard. This is a Rosh Chodesh melody, which is coming up for Nisan, right? This is a Rosh Chodesh melody from Rabbi Aaron, the cantor of Brisk. And we see here notational exercises. This is very interesting. In fact, you can read, you see this little triangle-y thing, this little pyramid thing? This is the what we know as do, re, mi, fa, so. This is ut, re, mi, fa, so in Yiddish, in Hebrew characters. So here you see him here, and also further up, writing out notational exercises as part of performing what's called mutation psalmization, and he's doing this in Yiddish. Now, any music treatise of this period, these are exercises that are opening any music treatise that you would find, even though they come from the era of mensural notation, the earlier form of notation, and have nothing to do with what you're going to be doing with modern notation, like we'll see later, and like they knew and we know today. So hexachordal theory and things like that you would need to interpret mensural notation are not relevant for Rossi himself. So here we have not just the history of one book, but of two books. We have a cantor who has got this copy of Rossi, who needs to find some kind of music book in Nikolsburg in order to decipher Rossi's Hebrew musica. And he's dutifully, like a good, he's following it, kehilchata, according to the law, doing the exercises from the beginning of the book, just like he thinks he's supposed to, even though they're ultimately irrelevant for reading the Rossi itself. The Jews don't know this, they're just following what's in the book. And I owe this suggestion to the scholar Elam Rotem, who works a lot with this kind of material. So here in Nikolsburg, the use of musica and of music notation is emerging really for the first time in this region as a religiously relevant technology. How do we get to this unique moment? For more on the culture of music and fraternity and the relationship between Prague's cantors, let's move on to another cantor who probably saw this exact copy of Rossi. This is one of my favorite cantors in history, is Rabbi Shlomo Lifshitz. Rabbi Lifshitz was one of Rabbi Oppenheim's prize yeshiva pupils. He was born into a cantorial family in Fürth in Germany, and he went to the yeshiva with Rabbi Oppenheim in Nikolsburg. And in his life, he achieved what so many could not. He became a full-time cantor. In his second pulpit in the German city of Ferse, he says, Parakti et ol hashchita me'al savarai. I threw off the yoke of having to do ritual slaughter from my shoulders, and I no longer had to teach children anymore. These were typical occupations of the cantorate then, as now. And he could focus on avodah achat, one service, the service of the minor temple, the Mikdash Ma'at, that is, the synagogue. He was headhunted to come to Prague and become a prominent cantor, eventually becoming the Chazan de Mata, or the chief cantor, and singing in the Pinchas and Tzigoiner synagogues in the first decade of the 18th century. He also wrote this epic cantorial manual that you see on the left, which is probably the most wonderful and colorful bit of Jewish musicology, history, and cantorial ethics that you'll ever find. And in this, he speaks, and you'll see this on the right, about the Prague community during his time, both positively and negatively. This is what he says. As for me, when I was the communal chazan of the holy community of Prague, the elders of the generation said that a while ago, all the cantors were together in love and brotherhood and peace and friendship. And this was evident by the fact that they would study and ask questions about Yom Tov, about festivals, a few days before the holiday. Pesach laws, Passover laws on Passover, Shavuot laws on Shavuot, Sukkot laws on Sukkot, and on the high holidays, all of the customs and melodies in their appropriate places. And there were among them some cantors who were skillful in chokhmat musika, in the science of music, and every festival they would write new melodies. And there were other cantors who learned melodies from them, and they were thankful and not embarrassed. But now, it's not that way. Everyone builds boneh bama atzmo. Everyone builds a stage for himself and wraps himself in someone else's talit, which means no one who fears God would do. And he does not want to study from his friend, saying, "Who is so-and-so that I will study with him? I myself am a good singer. He should come study with me." So what have we learned? In Prague, the cantorate is becoming a professional community with, at one point, organized Jewish study and musical innovation from trusted leaders, including in Chokhmat HaMuzika and the science of music. But, according to Rabbi Shlomo, egos and reputations are beginning to get in the way, something which has never happened in cantorial history since. When cantors become involved in musical innovation and artistic music, fraternity is possible, but competition is always a temptation. Now we know that Rabbi Shlomo Lifshitz saw the very copy of Rossi we were looking at a few minutes ago because he describes it in his book as a Sefer Yashan, an old book from Venice dealing with musica, and then he reproduces the complete text of all 5 rabbinic hasmachot, all of the 5 very long rabbinic recommendations saying this book is good. From the introduction to every copy, every part book of Rossi's volume. So we know that Rabbi Shlomo had exposure to music through Rossi and probably saw that very copy. So like the Klezmer Guild, we see that the cantors in Prague were organized and aware of their vocational identity. It's not surprising that this era is the one in which the cantorate becomes self-aware, in which cantors begin to write about themselves. In this book, Tudat Shlomo, in Shirei Udan, 1697, and in the final book we'll look at today, Reach Nichoach, in 1724. All 3 books are by cantors, and they talk to their colleagues saying, Hine achai hachazanim, behold my cantorial brethren, and then exhort them to not be shmendriks and to do things according to Jewish law, and not to sing so long and go to shul on time and all that stuff. But I'm going to even show you a glimpse of all these cantors gathered together at the same time on an auspicious day in the spring of 1716. Oh, it was a great day, when a parade was put on by the entire Prague Jewish community in honor of the birth of the Habsburg Prince Leopold. Take a look at this. That's a big old parade. I don't know how they got 2 giants, number 22, but they really outdid themselves. This is called the Prager Aufzug. You can see here a confident Jewish community. Remember, there's 10,000 Jews in Prague in 1700. This is shortly in the center part of Prague. You can see a big parade here. A separate but strong Jewish community celebrating a royal birth. You can see on the top of these triumphal arches there are klezmorim playing instruments. There's a very precariously placed child with a chalumeau. There's a ton of things going on here. And by the way, this isn't the first time they did this. This is the second. And they're going to do it again in 1741, the next time a Habsburg emperor has an heir. But where are the chazonim? Can anyone find them? Anyone tell me which number they are? If you can look closely, what number are the cantors? Anybody? It is number 19. And number 20. We say, actually, I think it was under number 20, but the people they're talking about are there in 19 because the organ is there. Here's what the Yiddish reads. This is Western Yiddish. It says, then come 4 Pashonen. There are 4 people come carrying an organ, played upon by the exalted Rabbi Marum, the son of Rabbi Mordechai Bash. And then come great cantors from every synagogue in the community who pleasantly sing and make music together with the organ. Anyone knows this is not the big pipe organs like we have probably in the Spanish synagogue in Prague. These are positif organs. These are small, more portable organs, and we're going to learn a little more about them later. So we see here the cantors all united as part of a professional group. It shows their unity as a class, as musical representatives of both their synagogues and of a greater community in which they have their role to play. And you know what? We even have one of the tunes that was sung that day. You guys are like one of, I think, I've played this for maybe 3 groups. These big parades always had, Baroque festival booklets that went with them. This is only one of the booklets has sheet music, and I'm thankful to Rachel Greenblatt, who's at Brandeis and Dartmouth, for pointing it my way. This is a piece of music sung in honor of Carolus der Sechs, that is Charles VI, and you're going to hear it sung by a cantorial student, a Geiger colleague in Germany, and a Washington Bach consort bass baritone in Pomerantz. This is also on. Good. can march a little bit if you want. There you go. Sounds very, you feel it. You feel like you could be in the march that day and sing 53 verses of this naturally in German from then. Now, it's important to note that, again, the Jews were trying in making these festival booklets, and perhaps in the form of the music they're picking for this procession, which is very typical Baroque German-esque procession music. In order to, the Jews were trying to demonstrate, as Rachel Greenblatt points out, the high cultural achievement of Jews. Sound familiar? Because it's this same cultural motivation that's going to make Ashkenazim come back to Salomone Rossi in France in the mid-19th century. So, the use of music notation is on one hand, as we saw in Moravia with Cantor Moshe, religiously motivated, with Rossi as this authentic material of Jewish engagement with Chochmat HaMuzika. But here in the parade, it's also culturally motivated expression of achievement in the gaze of the majority culture of Prague. So, but now let's get down to business. The ascending profile of cantors in Bohemia and Moravia is also observable in legal documents outlining the responsibilities and character of the cantor's office. As we saw with Cantor Lifshitz, cantors began to be seen not just for their piety, but their reputations and prestige and vocal abilities. Many of them had titles such as HaMishorer HaGadol, the great singer. In the Middle Ages, cantorial contracts were little parts of board minutes, not so remarkable. They were just jotted down. But here in Prague, we see fit-to-purpose cantorial contracts as part of a larger ascent of cantorial legal documentation and status. This one that you're looking at is from the Tikkun. This is like the standard document booklet of Rabbi David Oppenheim which predates the 1730s. And here in this cantorial contract, the language is flowery, replete with biblical quotations and executed in rhyme. I wish my cantorial contracts were executed in rhyme. That would make them so much more easy. The cantor is, of course, required to be pious, to know all the prayers in their plain and mystical meanings, to chant the prayers of the community according to its minhag, according to its custom, to be at synagogue every morning for worship, to read the Torah and be knowledgeable in its grammar and meaning, and you'd be fined for every single mistake. I'm glad they didn't put that in my contract. The community would reward the cantor then with ample compensation, and the contract says so he should not lack anything, along with a place to live for his family. An interesting contrast, actually, if you think all the way back to the Talmud and its original ideals for the Shaliach Tzibur, which is poverty, because you want the cantor to really mean it when he's asking for parnaso. So, again, we have this rise in status and a rise in compensation. Now, Rabbi Shlomo Lifshitz actually, yes, this is the joke part of today. I haven't made any before. Rabbi Shlomo Lifshitz actually makes a joke in his book about cantorial salaries. Lifshitz writes that if you read in Sefer Mitzvot Katan, the Samak rules, that the cantor should pronounce each and every word as if he is counting gold coins. You guys are getting to the punchline before me. So Rabbi Lifshitz says, quote, "By way of a joke, I said that it is right to give the cantor a significant salary so that he has something to count, and a voice that is in the habit of counting, and that which is customary to be counted itself. Then he will pronounce the words like he is counting gold coins." There, you guys are right with me. I'm so happy. Thank you. Now remember, Rabbi Lifshitz is one of the first to make it as a full-time cantor. This is a chidush. This is a new thing, which cannot be contemplated without being well paid. He finds this in his second job in Ferzi in Germany, and following that in Prague. and is advocating in his book for the continuation of such practice so that he and other cantors can focus on what matters most. And he's very sad when he looks out in the villages and he sees all these poor cantors. They have to be butchers, and they come in and they're dripping with blood from the shechita, and they don't know that they should have white garments on. He sees what's happening in the poor rural cantorate, and he's like, oy vey, this is missing the kuhuna. This is missing the priesthood, the vocational seriousness of the cantorate. So we need to pay them well in order that they can do the job the best. Another cantorial writer will say, it's like the Kohen Gadol, right? He has to have beautiful vestments, right? And the cantor is bimkom Kohen Gadol. This is something that gets repeated again and again in these cantorial moralists. Now, we actually have Rabbi Lipschitz' contract from Metz in eastern France, but it's not as good as the next contract we're going to see. And I want to thank Olga Sixlova from Charles University in Prague, who sent me this contract from 1717 from the Klausen Synagogue, made with one Rabbi Yaakov Drobitscher, a well-regarded, even famous Polish cantor, likely from the place of his name, Drohobych, now in the Ukraine. And he even has a nickname. He's Rabbi Yaakov, but his nickname is Rabbi Yo-Kol. So instead of Yankov, is Yo-Kol. He has a voice. Yo-Kol. So it's in the contract. And it's interestingly a shared contract between two synagogues for one person. The Klausen Synagogue and the Pinchas Synagogue say, we gotta get this guy. Okay, you put in, together we have the money for him. We don't have the money for him separately, but this is what they say. They're gonna agree to accept him, that he should exclusively serve as their Shaliach Tzibur for a period of 3 years, maintaining his own singers. It says Mishorer Zinger, so we're gonna get to the choristers, those singers at the end, who are wonderful and also very transgressive and controversial. This cantor will spend 2/3 of his time at the Klausen Synagogue, at the Klausen Synagogue, and 1/3 of his time at the Pinchas Synagogue. And it's kind of hilarious how they really just break this whole thing down. Okay, 3-year terms, he's going to be here 3 years, 2 Yom Kippurs at the Klausen Synagogue, one Yom Kippur at the Pinchas Synagogue, Rosh Hashanah Day 1 at the Klausen Synagogue, Rosh Hashanah Day 2 at the Pinchas Synagogue, and so on and so forth through all the holidays, 2 Shabbosim a month, 2 Sabbaths a month at the Klausen Synagogue, 1 at the Pinchas Synagogue, and then the whole week of davening for the weekday services, the whole week of prayers in between. Now, for his trouble, this cantor is getting paid 15 Ranish Gulden per week for his 3-year term, along with furnishing a living space for him and bringing his family from Poland. It's a pretty good sum. Shlomo Lipschitz is making 300 Reichsthaler which is about today. He's making only 200 of that, so he's making 20,000. But it's right about $20,000 today. But this guy is making 760 Gulden, which is about 520 Reichsthaler. So he's making over 50 grand. So he in that era is comfortable. He's comfortable. So again, we're showing that while the medieval standard of low-paid cantorial work was the norm, and still in the rural areas, urban environments and the prestige economy of cantors allows them to achieve even full-time jobs as a possibility, and with them, a life more devoted to the practice of music and singing. Now, Prague is one place where cantors do develop an especially musical focus to their vocations, but that didn't mean they stopped doing all of the other mitzvahs, all of the other important communal obligations and duties associated with being Klei Kodesh, being a holy worker. Let's take a moment to dwell on a special song which shows the heartfelt admiration for the Prague community for one of its cantors. The cantor Lippmann Poppers, he died in 1656, was a well-known cantor. His epitaph describes him as Rosh Mishorerim, a head chief of singers, a lamdan who was learned in Talmudic studies, meticulous in pilpul, Talmudic debate. He oversaw all of the mohalim, which are the ritual circumcisers. He was big in redeeming captives and also in visiting the sick. This gentleman was so beloved that one of the prominent Jews of Prague, Hirsch Tausig, published a memorial song in Yiddish upon the cantor's death. Now, you're looking at it republished by a Christian Hebraist, Christoph Wagenseil, in an appendix to his commentary on Tractate Sota, hence the Latin. But this copy you're looking at looks like it's German. Don't be fooled. It's actually Western Yiddish, Old Yiddish, transcribed by a German speaker. And I'm actually able to sing it for you because you see where it says in Hebrew there, Benigun brons, it looks like lich, but it's actually lied. Benigun brons lied. This song is actually a song that we know, frequently used for sad Yiddish songs, and indicates the German folk song Braune Farbe und Freundlichkeit. As in this era, so many of the songs that were written, the texts that were written, many by cantors or other songwriters and musicians, were set to music of in the air, of the oral culture of their place. So sit back, I will sing for you, or attempt to sing, 2 verses of this song written in honor of a pious cantor. Ein Sofer sein Gleichen zu finden nicht in der ganzen Welt von alle Geschrift. Sivrei Teure hat geschrieben und Zahl. Sein Sechus soll uns bestehen überall. Ein Chasen für der ganze Welt. Ein Iglicher wird mir bezeugen auf den Herd. So ein Chasen war nicht gehört. Durch sein Sechus sollen wir nicht werden verstört. It's a sweet melody, right? Thanks. Now, the organ and how cantors were involved in it. One instrumental tradition in Prague, which cantors also played with, is the organ, famous for being played in synagogues like the Alten Neuschule and the Meisel Schule, for instrumental Kabbalat Shabbat. These were not the large pipe organs that we know of or think about today. These were small, often portable organs that you just as easily find in processions, weddings, dance parties, people's homes, or in bars. This is where the Ashkenazim are getting their music, not from the court. They're going to the bar, they're going to the tavern where they have to hang out and do big things anyway. So what we saw in this procession here is a positive organ, and you can see here actually, the earliest, it's carried by 4 people on 2 horizontal poles. The earliest record I could find of a Jewish organist was a guy named Mandel, who was recorded in 1605 as having played at Christian weddings. But at least one Christian, this is the crazy part, at least one Christian in 1494 imagined that Jews played the positive organ. Here it is, pictured in a small Christian prayer book called from Prince Lobkowitz, called the Lobkowitz Breviary, in a miniature entitled Music of the Jews in the House of God. These are apparently Jews. It looks more like Purim than anything else. No one's at the bima there, but there is a guy playing on the organ. And I want to get in your ear a little bit of what this kind of organ sounds like. It doesn't sound like a massive, war horse of a church organ. It sounds like a little organ. Let me play a little for you. This is not Jewish music. This is just this kind of organ. 3, 2, 1. There we go. So again, this is not an organ that's gonna, bulldoze the congregation with its, strength. This is an ensemble instrument that's used for processions. It's used in a little more low church, let's say, parts of life. Now, cantors in Prague and beyond were also involved in, as might be natural, in the composition of Hebrew and Yiddish songs, including in one case we know with organ accompaniment. This is from 1677 from a Ashkenazi Siddur, and the Siddur is printed in Prague featuring this song for before L'Chadodi by a famous cantor then, Rabbi Shlomo Zinger. It says a nice song, Zemel Na'eh, by Rabbi Shlomo Zinger, which they sing in the Holy Community of Prague in the Meisel Synagogue. Anyone been to the Meisel Synagogue? I see a few hands. There we go. There we go. So the Meisel Synagogue with organ and strings before Lechadodi. This is a normal part of the instrumental Friday night tradition that was brought in mystically to bring joy to the people as part of bringing in the joy of Shabbat in Kabbalat Shabbat. One interesting feature of the song, by the way, which is a little red arrow, it says, Kishemenagnin babayit al hashulchan musifin. So we see, that means if you're singing this at home, add this verse. So we get a really interesting insight that the song output of this era that's paraliturgical, that's kind of like extras to the liturgy, actually transfers between the synagogue and home ritual and the singing of the home. Now, already by this time, Prague was famous for its use of the organ. In this song, Die Schreefelied von Prague from 1689, which is about the friar in Prague that you can see a picture of from that era right there. The author laments, on Sabbath Eve, people made noise with the organ. Now, because of our many sins, everything is fallen in flame. From far off lands, its cantors came for us to hear. Now, sadly, God, you have distressed us. Oy lanu ki chatanu, woe to us, for we have sinned. So while the use of the positive organ was liturgically limited to instrumental Kabbalat Shabbat, it of course later becomes a halachic precedent in the 19th century for the Reform movement. And if you want, you can look at this wonderful article by the late Rabbi David Ellenson, who talked about this as a precedent in Reform for bringing the organ into worship. And also, because I know you wanted to hear musical examples, let me return to play you the song written by Cantor Rabbi Shlomo Zinger. This is his Ich öffne mein Mund on alle Spott. I open my mouth without mockery. This is a moralistic song reminding people of reward and punishment and encouraging them to return to lives of righteousness. And he put this to a romance melody. I might have the spelling wrong. Es friesig us ein junger Margraf. A young Margraf courted. This is a German song that was in the air, translated into Western Yiddish from the lands there. Now, what I'll play for you is not exactly how it was done. This is a modern ensemble called Simchat HaNefesh, which is led by my advisor, Dr. Diana Matut, there on the left, with her early Yiddish music band, Simchat HaNefesh. So you can see one way in which people have interpreted this melody for today. Pretty, right? It's a pretty song. All right. Well, they make it very pretty because they got the bells and everything. It was probably just some guy on the street going, da, 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 da. It was probably, just one person singing. All right. Now we get to the juicy bits. We've covered the cantors and their growth as a professional community, their religious experimentation with Chochmat HaMuzika, the science of music, minimally indicating Western notation, their economy of reputation, and their increase in compensation in urban areas, which provides cantors the opportunity of full-time or near full-time employment, giving them more opportunity for devotion and development of sacred music. But one of the most critical and crucial innovations in the history of the Ashkenazic cantorate comes from Prague and Bohemia. It is the rise of the Mishorim, of cantorial assistants. These were small groups of singers joining the cantor. Now, before Prague and Bohemia had this big creative explosion in this era, in the 17th century, there were groups of singers in Germany. There were Mishorim, general Mishorim, groups that would sing for holidays or life cycle events when a woman had just given birth and she came back into the synagogue a week after she had given birth. For an Ufruf, there would be special songs during the Piyut Eladon. This was a normal thing, and it's observed in Italy and Germany by the early 17th century. What distinguishes Prague in particular, and then it spreads from there in my contention of my research, is that is the index case for professional mishoriim, for professional singers with named role designations like the bas, the low voice, the bass, right? The zinger, the tenor, and the tiskant, the boy or someone with a high voice. This institution of the Ashkenazic choir begins in the mid-17th century and spreads to become a nearly transnational Ashkenazic liturgical practice over the next 2 centuries. And all over the place in Eastern Europe, beyond the idea of the mishorim becomes an institution later on in different aesthetic forms in the cantorate in general. Now, the mishorim of this era are not singing harmony. They're mostly just alternating really instrumental textures with the cantor, giving him time to rest. And most of the manuscripts of these singers point to singing in a fairly Western Baroque style, at least by the time we start to have this kind of stuff written down in the second half of the 18th century. In fact, they more often provide instrumental textures, seemingly imitating bassoons and flutes and the like, rather than simply vocal textures. So think of them as sort of proto-a cappella groups, in a way. And the earliest evidence we have for them is in the synagogues of Prague and the surrounding areas. One reason we know this is because the earliest instances of their last name, Bas and Zinger, come from Prague with Shlomo Zinger and another guy. This guy, his name is Shabtai Mishorer Bas. His name is literally bass singer. That's his last name. He and his brother, these are his books, I'll explain. He and his brother fled the Swedo-Muscovite Wars of 1655, migrating from Kalisz to Prague, where Shabtai served as a synagogue bass singer under cantor Leib Shir HaShirim. And he was happy to adorn 13 of his books that he published with title pages featuring Chochmat HaMuzika, featuring notations of here on the left we have Az Yashir, Moshe, we have a notation of that, and then here on the right we have Yigdal Elohim Chai, and a guy holding this big sheet music thing up above. We see named bass singers in parades in Prague dating to 1678, and by 1680 the practice of both traveling itinerant star cantors and bass singers has migrated to Nikolsburg in Moravia. Now we find in the laws there in Mikolov and Nikolsburg some pretty illuminating ordinances. First, the community of Nikolsburg restricts its cantors from appointing itinerant unmarried basses to sing with them without communal consent. And second, it limited assistant cantors from engaging any mishorim other than their own sons. Now this suggests, at least to me, the subversive potential of itinerant musicians in the face of communal norms. The ideal cantor by Jewish law is not typically permitted to go before the ark if he is unmarried, particularly on the high holy days. And furthermore, one of the standard features of the cantorial terms of hire, dating all the way back to the Middle Ages, is that you can't leave the city without express consent of the community. So, itinerant cantors who are not rooted in one community, and their basses, their mishorim, represent a potential subversion of communal leaders' authority, as well as presenting potentially unfit candidates to lead the congregation in prayer. The requirement of communal consent for hiring gigging basses and restricting mishorim candidates to the cantor's sons thus attempts to apply traditional parameters for the cantor's appointment to choristers as well. The hosting of traveling guest cantors from other towns was also a norm, as was their distinction by fame and reputation. The Nikolsburg laws restrict guest cantors from leading the Shacharit and Musaf service on Shabbat unless they have also led Kabbalat Shabbat and Kiddush the previous night, a stipulation which is waived in the case of a, quote, famous cantor. It's a thing. Thus, in an era of rising demand for traveling guest cantors and singers, communal leaders are seeking into reign this populist and potentially religiously problematic musical innovation in synagogue life. Now, this is a nice picture, isn't it? Here's the fun part, because even though mishorim became a viral feature of urban and then more rural synagogue life, they also, together with cantors, represented, as we saw above, potentially transgressive behavior. And by the way, not saying anything about the behavior of these gentlemen, but this is a wonderful thing that just came out on auction, a community minute book from Ranitze. It might be a community minute book, or it might be a Stender book for the cantor and the gabbai. But it's from Ranitze in 1722, and you can see there in the middle, the cantor, and then we have the bas, who's very well dressed on the left, and then we have the zinger, the youth, and this is the standard cantorial trio that evolves and is still around 100 years hence when Reform is gearing up. Now, as this phenomenon spreads, rabbis get very angry at the excesses of these new synagogue singers who are known, not in Prague, for being drunk, for being impious, for messing up the prayers, and for doing silly things on the bima, like holding their faces and gesticulating wildly. Fortunately, no choirs have ever been accused of such behavior since. And I will say that there are way fewer reports of this bad behavior in Bohemia and Moravia than in Poland, where it's really bad, or in Western Europe, where the rabbis are going absolutely bananas. So pack yourselves on the back, lovers of Czech Jewry. I speculate that this is probably because the Ashkenazic norm of cantors also being rabbis, and thus being a little closer to the orbit of religious normativity, was well maintained in Bohemia with its strong yeshiva in Nikolsburg and tradition of Jewish learning, keeping artist types from going too over the edge by also immersing their lives in piety. But in cities, other cities like Worms and Amsterdam and London and Hamburg, and in little villages, by 1700, things are a mess. Musical innovation and cantorial impiety is like a bull in the halachic china shop, trampling the norms of morality and the theurgical precision of prayer and giving cantors a very bad name indeed. I could spend a whole lecture just with funny jokes and fits of rabbinic dismay inspired by these transgressive artists, but that's for another time. But for our purposes in focusing on the Czech Lands, it's notable that one of these critiques, an anonymous broadsheet, three scream, this is referring to the cantor bass zinger trio, three scream and none are answered, eventually makes its way back to Bohemia, where it is anonymously reprinted. This is the document on the right. There's only one of them. It's at the Bodleian Library. It's called Tochecha Lachazanim, Rebuke of Cantors. We know this is likely from Bohemia for two reasons. One is that it contains additional references to the Kuzari of Yehuda Halevi and the Jewish book, the Kuzari, as Dr. Adam Shear has established, is really pretty much only read in the region of Bohemia at this time in the early 18th century. But second, we're pretty sure it's this book because it corresponds directly to a known response, a rhymed defense of cantors in Yiddish and in Hebrew, written in 1724 called Reach Nichoach. And we're going to end with Reach Nichoach because it really brings together the fruits of the early modern cantorate, but problematizes them in an interesting way. Its author, Yoel Sirkis, not to be confused with the Bach, the Bayit Chadash, I think it's his grandfather, was born in Poland, likely in the 1650s or 1660s, migrating west following the Chemnitsky massacres. His father was a cantor. He married a cantor's daughter in Kolin in Bohemia, and two of his sons grew up to be cantors. And he spent pretty much his whole career in a small town of Lipa, or I think Česká Lipa is how it's said in Czech, please correct me, where he lived until at least 1737. And he was pretty old by then. And he wrote two books in his old age. The first, Reach Nichoach, is a bilingual rhymed defense of cantors against an anonymous critic. This document defends cantors from charges of being fat, being loud, being ignorant of prayers, harassing congregations for donations, and having horribly undignified mishorim, or singers. I wrote my master's thesis on this book, which you can read online, and I want to highlight just one final section for you before I take questions, because it has really just important implications, I think, even today. Reach Nichoach rebuts a cultural critique from Tochecha Lachazanim that cantors scream too loudly, whereas Italian Jews, and as it says up here, in the land of Africa and Ishmael, that is Turkey and North Africa, Jews sing al pi ha-musika. They sing according to music. To this, Sirkis has a number of critiques. This one is particularly instructive. He says, in the lands of Eretz Ishmael and Africa, this should be really just Turkey and North Africa, the nations forbid us to pray with a wail, but as for us, we, thank God, have a king of love and mercy. May God lengthen his days and years with pleasantry, him and his wife and his seed till generations end, for he has always been good to us. So we have permission to pray, lehipael ke'avat nafshenu, to pray as our souls move us, loudly and with music too. And no one complains or gives reproof. Even the princes and governors under whom we dwell, may God lengthen their days and years, treat us well. Now here, circus implies a lot of interesting things. One is that volume, loudness, which is a marker of not just Bohemian and Moravian prayer, but also of Polish-Lithuanian Jewish prayer. Loudness and volume, which is actually complained about by Western Europe. These Eastern European cantors come over like, oh, they scream, they're loud, they should be quiet. They scream the Torah reading, they scream the davening, they scream the prayers. That this loudness is actually the sound of freedom. The Italians and the Turks, he says about the Italians in another section, the Italians and the North Africans and the Turks have to be quiet because they are oppressed. But we have great local and regional government, and we're not afraid to be ourselves. So we see this, and we saw this in the self-confidence of that Prague community, that huge community, putting on a political display in 1716, just 8 years before this. The self-confidence of that community doing 3 big Baroque parades in honor of the heir to the Habsburg throne. Despite the unfortunate reality that in the 1740s, Empress Maria Theresa expels the Jews and radically alters that sense of safety. It's very telling about how Czech Jews in the early 18th century felt about their sense of security and how it is connected to their ability to musically express themselves. Now, the second issue comes back to our opening question of Rossi in Moravia and the place of music. Circus says that the author of this anonymous critique must be from, here it says Ishmael in Africa, this is Turkey, or from North Africa. He also says Italy and another place. Shemagnim al pia musica, which sing according to music, with voices low and melodies pleasing, simply according to the breathing. Bekol namuch v'ne'imot rak al pi haneshimot. Zehu lehem l'shabeach kamo halevi al hazevach. This is worthy in their eyes like Levites at the sacrifice. Now, the term music or muziki was also part of the Turkish language. Actually, I was just talking to Professor Feldman, who was here a couple months ago this week, and he reminds me the term Chokhmata Musika in Turkish, the science of music, appears in Prince Kantemir's treatise on music in 1700 in Turkey. So what's telling here is that Circus is actually making a distinction between Ashkenazic prayer, which is loud and not al-piha musika. It's not, he's making a contrast between that and Turkish music with its traditions of metrical singing. From what we know of him, Yoel Circus was not a world-traveling musicologist. He may have had some exposure to Turkish Jews in Lublin in his youth, albeit amidst the horror of the pogroms afflicting that city in the mid-17th century. Whether through personal experience or acquired knowledge of other Jewish groups, Circus saw Ashkenazic prayer features like screaming, mashurim, and perhaps even non-metrical singing as culturally distinct. While defending similar aspects of cantorial practice as his contemporary, Rabbi Shlomo Lifshitz, another cantorial ethicist, Circus is an example of a more conservative approach, seeking to laud and preserve the Ashkenazic soundscape rather than enhancing it with music from Eastern Sephardic or Italian traditions. To conclude, by the time our copy of Salomoni Rossi, of the Salomoni Rossi Hashirim Hasher Li Shlomo part book passed into the hands of a Moravian cantor, the cantorate to which he belonged had begun to articulate itself as a specialized musical profession. The scale and overall continuity of Jewish settlements in Czech Lands, popular religious and mystical investment in music, and economics providing higher salaries to talented musicians provided opportunities for both organization among klezmers and vocational awakening among cantors as a distinct profession. Cantors in Czech Lands in the early modern period were part of what may be called the first golden age of Chazanut, or one of the first golden ages of Chazanut, in which the musical technologies and forces involved in sacred music expanded to include mishorim, instruments, and aesthetic lessons drawn from Western music practices. These experiences were concentrated at first in urban centers and slowly disseminated along with their practitioners into the countryside. Over the course of the 18th century, these musical practices would become part of an emerging transnational culture of Ashkenazic prayer chant, drawing the ire of countless rabbis, but also forming some of the core forms of what we know of the cantorial music and the cantorial profession today. I want to thank you again for your time and the Society for History of Czechoslovak Jews, and I'll now take your questions and comments. Thank you. Questions, yes?
Just a practical question. Thank you. Hi. I understand music is read left to right, and that Hebrew is read right to left. Mm-hmm. I'm looking at this and trying to figure out which way does the music go. Does the music go right to left, or does the Hebrew go left to right?
Yes. So the music goes, the Hebrew goes left to right, but the music goes right to left. And this is a solution that Israelis actually really had to deal with in their era. There are some experiments, I think even before that, with like left the music and the Hebrew going in the same direction. It didn't work out. We ended up with basically, I think, the same thing that Rossi is doing. But even here, you see that the Yiddish, for the solemnization exercises, the ut, re, mi, fa stuff, here is coming, right to left, but the exercises, of course, are coming left to right.
Right. So when you are working with a new score, what are you looking at? I mean, how do you approach it versus attack it? Does it have Western style notation, or is it something that is coded and you say, okay, it's in this pitch or in this? Because I don't see any sharps or flats. It all looks like all whole notes.
No, these are simply, we're not looking at a composition here. These are really just exercises for understanding how to do mensural notation, which is really, the crazy thing is that by this time, this is already out of style. No one is doing this. Basically, a Jew is picking up, found Rossi, it's like, man, I have to figure out how to read this. Let me just go pick up a music treatise and do whatever it says. And it happens to be that these music treatises kept in the introductory chapters from old-style mensural notation practices, even if they go on to describe a completely different system. This is I'm relaying this from learning with Elam Rotem on these treatises, and he knows about them much better than me.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you.
There you go.
Yes.
Worked with bellows. Oh, hi. The organ needs bellows, right? Mm-hmm. So already it's that whole idea of, are you allowed to play instruments? Is that a form of work? But who would be running the bellows? Would that be like a Shabbos goy?
There is some history. I don't know if it's associated with Bohemia or Moravia specifically, of non-Jews assisting with instruments, but they would be doing all of the instrument stuff as like a Shabbos goy or a non-Jewish helper on Shabbat. Here, all of the instrumental Friday night service took place before sundown. Now in the summer, really late sundown, so they would go on for over an hour and a half of stuff before L'Chadodi of these paraliturgical songs, of other melodies. It was a very, religiously, mystically infused experience. So the people working the bellows are just, Jews around the organ at that time. And there were even, there's some evidence that there was a Jewish organ maker, because Jews were in the instrument making business as well as the music teaching business. And it's here actually where the non-Jewish guild, the Christian Musicians Guild complains that the Jews are like flooding the market and they're not teaching our kids music right because they're teaching them it sound Jewish and not sound proper. Now, the distinction of what sounds Jewish and not Jewish is very hard to reconstruct. Professor Feldman will tell you that already by the end of the 18th century, people could distinguish when klezmers played in a Turkish style and in a Jewish style. So this is a very, very hard, and all the music I played for you sounded pretty sort of mainstream Baroque, because that was the street music. So finding what's the, people want to find the essential Jewish sound, and that's sort of that's a quest. That's not something scholarship can necessarily give you from this era, because so much of it was really oral and in the air. Yes, we have a question up front. And over there.
Thank you. I've been to concerts, believe the group was called the Western Wind, and they performed Solomon Rossi's music at the Kaufman Center years ago. Now, was that music written for an Italian cantor, a choir, the entire congregation? Who sang it?
So the question is about Rossi, and which is I'll fully admit is not my area of expertise, but I will say that from what I know of it, it was a group. For example, Rabbi Leon de Modena convened a group of Jewish singers to sing Western style music on Shabbat and festivals. And Rossi's music is really meant for that. So it was a bunch of really Jewish singers that were organizing for that purpose. Dr. Josh Jacobson, if you look online, actually has a nice example where he puts Rossi together with the traditional Italian chant to show you what weaving that together would have been like. De Modena also, after the Mantuan Jews, there was an expulsion, and a bunch of them came to Venice. He started Accademia dell'Impediti. He started a Jewish music school very briefly. It didn't last so long. But that was really in the realm of the Renaissance, where Jews not only had access but motivation and context to perform in this style, even if it was quite short-lived, other than in the Ashkenazic afterlives of the sheet music. And I actually just presented on this in Venice, but from my home in Ohio, because Zoom. It's really interesting to follow the footprints of these books, because they really tell a story about what was the role of Rossi in people's lives after it was published, after they were outside the Italian context. Here is just one copy which has 3 different Ashkenazic owners that we can point to, and really no one's future study should be done on all of these little copies of Rossi. Do they have other stories to tell?
You talked about the cantor's salary. How did it compare to the rabbi's salary? And did it mean that young Jewish boys used the expected salaries in deciding their career path?
So one of the most fascinating bits of research that's yet to be done is sort of like how people find their way into these jobs. A lot of times for cantors, it's in the family. Like so many, Shlomo Lifshitz, father was a cantor, grandfather was one of the big cantors in Frankfurt. His kids are cantors. It's very, very like the priesthood, like the Levitical priesthood. It passes in families. So that's part of why people have a context in the background to learn all those traditions. I think the cantors generally made less than rabbis. That's all from all the contracts I've seen. I do not know yet whether it's different in this era, as it was. I believe that sort of in the and Dr. Jeremiah Lockwood, who's here, can correct me. In the golden age of Chazanut, the great big star cantors were making more money in these synagogues than some of the rabbis. But I can't speak to that with authority. But I believe that in this period, rabbis are still making more than cantors. But now, finally, a cantor can think, oh, I can do this I have more time for music. I can actually, delve into this and be serious about it in a religious way. Yes.
Thank you. Have you found nusach?
The question, have I found nusach? Nusach meaning elements of traditional Ashkenazic prayer chant. I actually came prepared for this because the answer is yes and no. It's mostly no in that we don't have a lot of transcriptions of synagogue song from this era. In fact, we have almost none. But we just, in the last 10 years, got one. I'm going to play it for you. It's not going to sound like Nusach in any sort of normative way that you know. Dr. Martha Stellmacher, who, by the way, she's a scholar in Germany, she just came out with a book on Prague's Jewish music in the 19th century through World War II with Van der Hoek and Ruprecht. I forget the title of it. It's, I think, from the Altneuschule to the Jerusalem Temple, except it's in German completely. But she found in 2015 a 15th century manuscript, a Christian manuscript, that had a notation of Tachanun. Some Christian went to a weekday service and listened to a Jew sing Tachanun. Now again, this is refracted through what, Bohemian rhombic menstrual notation could tell you. But I asked her to record it. I could sing it, but I wanted her to sing it because she discovered it, and she's getting ready to publish about it. So I don't want to steal her thunder, but I am sharing this with her blessing. This is it's Shuv Mecharon Apecha from Tachanun. That's just a little abyssal of it. If you look, she's talked to Dr. Boaz Tarsi, who was a Nusach specialist here at the ETS about this. You could argue it has some features when you look further on you could call it the Hashem Malach, the sort of Jewish Mixolydian mode. But again, it's refracted through a Christian hearing, and the transcription, she's even singing the real Hebrew. The transcription is, of course, fairly mangled relative to that. It's just guessing at what the Hebrew is because the guy didn't know, he just wrote it down. So we haven't found Nusach, but what I think we have found in terms of Nusach is this marriage of the metrical sort of German style of singing that we see very much in Bohemia and Moravia and the melismatic style of singing. And that's going to come in a big way from Poland. That's, if you know that when something's coming because rabbis get angry. There's tons and tons of angry rabbis in Poland at this era because they have given up a little of their authority. So they have a little cushier job, a little more symbolic job, but they don't get to pick who the cantor is anymore. And if you think about it, and this actually I think is one of the most critical things about this era, is that this is the age of print. How does the age of print transform the cantor's job? In the Middle Ages, if you're a cantor, you have to be able to not only memorize the liturgy, but probably make up your own piyutim, make up your own liturgical poems, right? Or at least remember a bunch of them. But now, with printing, it's been standardized. So this is a big thing that happens in the 16th century in Poland and also in Prague to a great extent, in Western Poland. All these rabbis are getting together and saying, we need to be mystically intentional in prayer, and how are we going to... These cantors are messing everything up. They're the enemies of well-done prayer. We need to have an authorized standard prayer book. But what does this do to the human spirit? Used to be, cantors could be like slam poets, right? You got to be able to make up your own piyut. You got to be religiously literate enough to do that. But now, poetry has been cut off. Where will the human soul express itself? If poetry is gone, then it's going to be music. And so it's natural, just at a human level, that in the age of print is where the explosion of musical creativity comes, where the amount of poetic creativity has been fairly stifled. And also in an era when rabbis are no longer picking who gets to be the cantor, and if you can learn the standard text, you can do it, right? It opens the field up to people who otherwise couldn't be cantors. Who are often more musical people. So again, this age of printing really is one of the main determining factors in opening up creativity in this era. Yes.
Isn't there a musical musicality criteria to be a cantor? I mean, do you have to sound like an opera singer? Because do you sing opera?
I like opera.
But do you sing it? Because we had a very famous person named Jan Pierce who was right? He was a cantor, right? And he became an opera singer? Oh, that's right, Richard. Right. All right, thank you.
So I will say about the sort of cantorial, again, this plays a little bit into the loudness aesthetic, that cantors in this era are meant to be loud. I think this has something to do, by the way, with synagogue construction. One of the main things that happens in Poland is that they stop making wooden synagogues and they start making big Gothic stone synagogues. So the means of vocal production and the acoustics and everything changes, so the technique is probably going to have to change. And all of their architects are like Baroque Italian guys. So again, and even in Reach Nichoach, even in this conservative guy, Circus, he says, hey, I learned from Chochmei Haumot, I learned from the wisdom of the non-Jews, of the nations, that if you stick your thumb in your like trachea or something, or manipulate your vocal mechanism, it'll make you be less loud. And people are saying, because the critics are saying, you're trying to do weird things with your voice and be too loud. It's like, no, this is a technique. But about being a professional singer, here's a great irony. Two of the main founders of the Frankfurt Minhag, the two cantors that sort of made the foundational 15th, 16th century, made the Frankfurt tradition, had horrible voices. And in fact, one of them writes, Naftali Hertz-Treves, who gets quoted in Edelson, if you've read the sort of the primary source literature, he gets quoted in Edelson saying, oh, the cantors, they don't know how to write Megillas anymore. They don't know how to read Torah anymore. They're getting ignorant. This guy writes that, hey, I wanted to be a cantor, but some other guy made fun of me because I had a bad voice. And I stopped being a cantor for a while. But then my students and my teachers encouraged me. And so I, with a bad voice, am going to dedicate my life to collecting all of the sodot tefillah, all of the mystical secrets and kavanot and implications and ways for people to mean the prayers with all of their heart. It's a very moving story. That the beginning of the cantor is actually some way by people who don't have good voices at all. So it's a great irony. Now we associate it with sort of the opera intersecting parts of the 20th and 19th century cantorates when the cantorial music was involved in that world in a different way, and also in training in conservatories and other things like that. So it's a more complex history than just that. That's what I'll add. Other questions? Yes.
Hi. Who is writing these tochachot and who is reading them?
Oh my goodness. Who is writing these tochachot? Really, it's a lot of rabbis and moralists. This is the age of Musar, right? This is the age where people, before Salanter, where people are looking out, and the Christians are having the same concerns. The Jews and the Christians they're going to bars, they're getting drunk, they're not performing the commandments, and these religious authorities are looking at their authority and their hold on the morality of their people crumbling away. And so the people who write these cantorial polemics, actually, a number of them do it anonymously. They say, I had to eliminate my name. There's one called Tochacha Megula, which is in this book called Reshit Bikurim from 1709. The guy says, I had to eliminate my name because the people are crazy out there. If I find out that I wrote this. And then he's like excoriating the cantors for their deportment, and they don't know how to extend the word, the and da 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 la la la, these nonsense syllables that they're singing, to the point that they eviscerate the words that they're trying to say. So it's really a lot of rabbis, but just people who are concerned for the moral character, or at least the theurgical, the mystical efficacy of prayer. And I want to add one more sort of emotional piece to this. There's a cantorial critic who's a cantor named Yehuda Leib Zelichover. He's from Polish town, Zelichov. He's living in Hamburg in the time of the opera, when the first public opera house comes to Germany in 1678. And he is just so concerned. Why? Because he lived through the heresy of Shabtai Tzvi. We were supposed to get redeemed and we didn't. Hugely traumatic thing. Why did this happen? It's because we're not doing the prayers right. And he excoriates his cantorial brethren for all of the things that they're doing, because this is why This is why the exile is so long. It's us, guys, it's us. So it's an emotionally sort of deep critique that comes not just from outside the cantorate, but a little bit from inside it as well, because they've had this traumatic event of the Sabbatean heresy not working out. And it's that same sort of sense that, well, we have to do it ourselves, that's going to lead to sort of the empowerment movement of Hasidism, where the individual, we have to, each, sort of, liberate the Sparks and I'm not going to say the right things about all the Hasidic stuff, but this sort of response to failed Messianism, because Messianism is always messy, is part of the charge behind and the hurt behind some of these big critiques. All right. I'm going to turn it over to Eva, and I want to thank you so much. If you want to learn more, you can find my academia.edu page. I have my writings on this, or you can follow my Substack. I write about Jewish music every week. Thank you so much.
I only have to give you a big thanks. And thank you very much for coming tonight. And please come to our next event in the fall.